Radio.ie hosts the Irish History Show podcast because history matters. Radio turns 100 years young this year. Radio's history is powered by Radio Archives. For radio archiving solutions from people passionate about radio, visit radio.ie.
Hello and welcome to the Irish History Show. My name is Cathal Brennan, and as always I'm joined by my co-presenter John Dorney from theirishstory.com. If you'd like to listen to this episode or any previous episodes, you can visit our website, irishhistoryshow.ie. You can follow us on Twitter @IrishHistoryPod or on Facebook, facebook.com/The Irish History Show. John has set up a Patreon for the Irish History Show, and you can find that on our website in the show notes as well for this episode. Now, this is a very special episode. This is the 100th episode of the Irish History Show. And it's hard to believe, John, that we've reached 100 episodes.
Yeah, well, I was doing the maths, Cathal, and we've been doing it since, I think, 2011.
Yeah.
So that's 100 in, how many years is that? 13 years.
I know, it's taken us a while.
Some years have been more productive than others.
Yeah, no, that's the thing. The long-suffering listeners to the show will know that it's a bit erratic getting out the episodes. But we're going right back to the start. Actually, the first episode of the show was not the first episode we recorded, because the first episode that we recorded, or the first episodes, were with Eve Morrison about the Bureau of Military History and Micheál O'Shucrú about the War of the Three Kingdoms, 1640s. And that's how me and you first got in contact. I put them up on archive.org, and John contacted me then.
Yeah, the people are probably curious as to how it came about, yeah, but this is it. So Cathal, I saw Cathal was putting out stuff, audio stuff, and I was trying to do the same thing with the Irish Story. And yeah, we met up in Trinity College, where Cathal was studying at the time as a mature student in history. And we went on from there. At the time, we had a partnership with Nair FM, which is a local radio station in the north side of Dublin.
But that's it. So we decided to begin the show, and originally it was The History Show for the first, 10 episodes or so. And then another show came along and took the name without by our leave. That was the RTE one. So we changed it to the Irish History Show, which made more sense because we just covered Irish history. Nair FM very kindly put us on. We had a lot of help there from Kieran Murray and Gavin Byrne. And we put the show on, and we'd record them in studio there, and they still broadcast the show now from time to time. But the other thing we should say as well, and you hear the ad at the start of the show every time, was Brian Green from radio.ie, an old friend of mine. He came on board as well, and he does the hosting for us too, and he has a couple of other podcasts he does as well. But it was interesting, like what I loved most about the fact that we had a podcast was that we could contact people to do episodes. And if you had an idea, you could just contact the person if you'd read a book or they were an expert in one particular field. And 9 times out of 10, they'd agree to come on and do an episode with us.
Yeah, and we've had really diverse people, like all kinds of people on the show, from David Fitzpatrick, the late, now sadly, Trinity College academic who never did interviews, did one with us on the book Terror in Ireland, which was out around that time, around 2011, to, for example, a White House historian from Washington, D.C. in America, to, I don't know, I mean, can you think of other standout examples? But we've had lots, though. Yeah?
We've had lots, and we've been very lucky in terms of the guests, like incredible generosity, everyone who's come on the show. We really did appreciate it. And then we have people like Brian Hanley, who's been on the show multiple times, talking about different things. A repeat offender.
Yeah.
And always great guest.
Padraig Lenihan would be another one.
Padraig Lenihan too, yes.
And there's a few more, I'm sure, that we're missing out there. But Fergal McGarry was on a lot in the early years.
Yeah, we were very, very lucky. And we were always hoping that with the podcast, that if we found it interesting, if there was a question that we wanted answered, there was people listening at home that probably wanted the question answered too.
Yeah, no, something actually that I'd like to bring up, which might be interesting for our listeners, is like when we do history ourselves, you always said it in the context of the times when it was. So the context of that time was the time of the crash.
Yeah.
So I went back to college because I was out of work, and you went back to college as well at that time.
Yeah.
The time of the economic crash, the post-Celtic Tiger era, I think was a time of real reassessment in the country. And I thought like our zeitgeist kind of fitted into that. I don't know if you felt that way as well.
We're coming up to something we're going to talk about now during the show, but we're coming up towards the decade of centenaries. Mm-hmm. And you would have had to live through the Celtic Tiger to realise how vacuous a lot of it was.
Completely. That's the word.
And
for people who don't remember that time, it was a time of like empty self-congratulation.
Yes.
Where it was like, it turns out Irish history finishes on a happy note because history is over now that we're economically successful. So we don't really have to examine anything at all anymore.
No, it was like we discovered Francis Fukuyama and the end of history and stuff like that.
Yeah, but the Francis Fukuyama Ireland version was like, now that we've embraced neoliberalism, turns out it was great, and why didn't we do this earlier,
Yes, like, do you remember the government ads for, was it 1916 or something, some commemoration of 1916, and it was images of LinkedIn and Twitter and Google and all these multinationals.
I mean, I think that's even a slightly later era because, like, the way out of the crash that the Irish government found was to basically invite in the multinationals on even better terms than they'd had before. You know? But yeah, I take the point though that like Irish history was somehow justified by economic success, or at least inviting in very large companies anyway.
Yeah. And this was the pat on the back, and they were all moving here because we were so amazing.
Yeah.
Nothing to do with tax rates or nothing to do with
access
creative
to the European market. Creative accounting.
Creative accounting.
But the funny thing is though, like, and one of the things that struck me as well was like, so the Celtic Tiger all fell apart, and this is the way, all this narrative of self-congratulation fell apart. Now, obviously, this was a hard time for many people, and I know people who suffered both personally and financially at that time. Like, but on the other hand, personally, I mean, I felt that as a somewhat liberating thing, that you were able to examine some of this stuff. And I mean, it got me rereading my history texts, like Joe Lee's History of 20th Century Ireland. And Joe Lee was writing in the 80s, which was another crash of a different kind. But there was a terrible feeling of almost self-loathing in what Joe Lee was writing then. And you could see the echoes of that in around 2009, 2010, 2011, around that time, that we'd failed. But it was a great time for self-re-examination, I feel. And people were going back to Irish history and saying, actually, we can learn from the past. History is not over. So it was a real hinge, I think, in kind of Irish intellectual history. And that was the way I felt about it. Anyway.
Yeah, no, very much so. And I think that even in wider things to wider areas like the Troubles, there had been such a very narrow definition of, or narrow interpretation of the Troubles. Not just recent Troubles, but also like the Democrats, dictators, school of the Civil War.
Yeah, I mean, one of the Celtic Tiger things was that the state turned out to be great. Everything that we did now was great here in the Republic, or the 26 counties, or whatever way you prefer to phrase it. And so therefore, things like the Civil War were stuff like, well, the good guys clearly had the right idea, which was the Free State, and so they were the Democrats, and then there was some sort of fascist dictators on the other side. And that did come from this whole idea of like, we finally joined the Western mainstream, and look, we're doing great. Why didn't we do this before,
Yeah. And
so the idea of challenging that, I think, was in a way to do with the fact that, like, no, history's not like that. Like, it's not a line that has an end point.
Well, even less challenged in some ways was the coverage of Sean Lemass and that period in the 1960s.
Yeah, Sean Lemass was kind of reimagined as the father of the nation in the Celtic Tiger period.
Yeah.
And people like his advisor, whose name escapes me right now.
T.K. Whittaker.
T.K. Whittaker, exactly. Yeah. Whose portrait is in government buildings in American Square, by the way.
But it was like Ireland has become the state that was put on the right course by Sean Lemass.
That's right, yes, that was the narrative. I mean, Sean Lemass would have probably had a much more nuanced view himself, but Sean Lemass was dead, of course, by the 2010s.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, so it was a time of re-examination. In regard to the Northern Troubles, I still think, and you might disagree with me here, but I still think that we were still in a period where people wanted to kind of forget about the Northern Troubles. Like, I think after a traumatic period of violence or conflict and stuff, there's a period afterwards where people just don't want to hear about it at all. They want to forget about it. And later on, there's big polemics about it. We're kind of in that phase now, I think, where people maybe don't have first-hand memories, or maybe they do, but a long time ago, of the Northern Troubles. want to really get into the weeds and talk about it. But my feeling at the time was that people didn't want to go there at all still. They wanted to block it out almost. Like, I mean, I know that a lot of the debates about the early 20th century in Ireland, about the War of Independence and the nature of violence, were proxy debates for the Troubles. But, you know, if you recall in 2009, you still had various Republican groups running armed campaigns. In 2009, they killed 2 British soldiers. I remember very clearly, like in work, and everyone was shocked and stuff. And then there was a policeman, a PSNI man, killed the next week. You know, so it was an echo of earlier times. People, it very much gave people a bad trip, if you like. It's my memory. And people didn't want to know at that time, I think. Now, it started to change again in the 2010s. I think people started to look back at things like what the British Army had been up to and so on. In the 1970s. But that also, I mean, it gradually came that people wanted to examine that. I think we're possibly not all the way there yet. It's very polemical, still.
It is very polemical, and it will be interesting because we are at that sort of a stage now where you could see really in-depth discussions about and examinations of what led up to the Troubles and that period and the Troubles itself. That there's, you know, oceans of books written about the Troubles.
Yeah.
But a lot of it is, you know, as you say, polemical. And
it seems to be getting more polemical, but I have a theory that this is just the cycle of things going, though, you know. I mean, if you look at the revolutionary period of the early 20th century, so there was a load of books written kind of just about contemporaneously, just afterwards. But then there wasn't anything for a very long time until kind of the 1960s.
Yeah.
I think that's a natural cycle of events, you know, where people don't want to hear about it then for a while. You know, there was a traumatic event, let's put it in the past. Yeah, we remember it, but we don't want to hear about it again. Yeah. And then it becomes like a part of kind of contested history, contested discourse, and, you know, once it's far enough away, people are more comfortable doing that. I think it goes in cycles like that, you know. You can, you know, if you look at, say, the Spanish Civil War, for example, like there's analogies there, like, you know, it's only like in the 1990s and 2000s the real history wars in Spain started about that, you know, once it's somewhat comfortably in the past, like where all the people around who were there at the 1930s are, a lot of them are dead and so on. I think that naturally goes in cycles with traumatic kind of events. But I think, the economic crash was a time, as I said, of re-examination of all of Irish history. Like we were looking at things like on our show as well, about the Irish language and the famine and plantations and so on like that, you know, so the wars of the 17th century, religion, the role of religion. You know, there's nothing like failure for re-examination, I feel.
Well, that's it. And the thing as well is that Irish history is so broad for such a small country. And there's still huge areas of Irish history that we haven't really touched yet at all.
Yeah. So most of our competence is about modern history. And we've almost nothing about medieval history and ancient history, for example.
Yeah, and it's something that I'd really love to delve into deeper. Now, one of the things as well when we were setting up the show is that we want to make an hour-long show with maximum 2 guests, usually 1 guest.
Yeah, we had 1 or 2 or 3, I think, but
but usually keeping it small.
Yeah.
With the idea being that you could really tease out these ideas and really have more detailed conversations about things. And I think that idea that everything had to be short, concise, kind of, you know, sells the audience short a bit.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the internet has changed that. Like, I mean, at that time, you know, the technology was just advancing so you could put hour-long things on, but it actually still was quite difficult to upload an hour-long thing. Like, you at the start, you had to, you know, when I was doing it for the website, you had to split it up into 10 or 15 minute chunks because that was all it could handle, you know. So the technology has moved on, allowing you to do that, allowing you to use the long stream. I mean, now you have some podcasts which are 3 or 4 hours, which I think is overkill. But the technology is one thing that's enabled that, I suppose. And
people are more used to, either on YouTube when they have the cameras there as well, watching or listening to podcasts that could be 2 hours on, could be 3 hours on.
Well, the patterns of consumption have changed an awful lot as well. Like, you know, when we started doing this, people would consume both the Irish Story, the website, and the podcast or the history show on PCs and laptops. And it was probably around 2017, because I had a metric for measuring this, that it switched over to phones, you know.
Yeah.
And this changes consumption an awful lot. So phone consumption is kind of, I would say, kind of passive. Something people listen to in the background. They're not really focused on, which is, it may or may not be a bad thing, but that's the reality we have anyway. But it does mean that people are more tolerant of longer things because they just have it on in the background while they're doing something else.
Yeah.
Going for a jog, whatever it is, and they have on with their earphones, and they're prepared to listen to almost unlimited podcasts while they do stuff.
Well, yes, and the thing I should say as well is that while we mentioned the guests and how lucky we are to get some really very, very good guests, great speakers.
Poach Gates, actually, another repeat offender.
Yes, is that we did an awful lot of episodes where it was just you and me.
Yeah.
And they're some of my favourite episodes.
Absolutely, yeah, likewise.
Because, like, to give one example, we did one about the Anglo-Irish Treaty.
Yeah.
And one of the reasons why we thought it was really important to do something about the Anglo-Irish Treaty of 1921 is there were so many misconceptions about it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So this was just talking about what was in the treaty, what led up to it, what was the immediate after effects.
Mm-hmm.
But, like, people believed that the treaty partitioned Ireland, all these different things.
Yeah.
That we could really, over the space of an hour or just over an hour, just go into all these type of things.
And you know what, I actually know even more about the treaty now. Like, you know, I've read the actual document in greater detail than I had back then. But yeah, I did like that episode. I remember recording it in your house, actually.
Yeah.
In Cambridge at the time.
Yeah. And the other thing as well that we've been quite lucky as a show is that a lot of the episodes matched your research, either in terms of the books that you've written or the projects that you've been involved with, like the recent Civil War project.
Yeah.
But as you were researching and you were writing,
yeah,
we could make an episode about a specific thing, like the Bridges job.
Yeah.
Was a particular chapter in your Civil War book.
And there was an article on the website first. So often you had write an article on the website, and then you'd say, okay, well, let's do a show about it.
Yeah. And then incorporating the podcast not just into, wherever you get your podcasts or the irishhistoryshow.ie, but also incorporating them into the Irish Story website too.
Yeah, and that was something I learned along the way, because at the start I was like, these are two separate things. And I had this brilliant idea of like having, I think I listed 60 shows on one page of the website, and now I would never do that, So it's good content for the website. And to be honest, it gets harder and harder to create new content for the website because you're getting older and you have less energy and you have more demands on your time and stuff.
Yes.
So podcast is an excellent way to fill it. And also, as I said, with the consumption patterns, like it used to be, believe it or not, on the website that an article that was 5,000 or 6,000 words long would get more views than a shorter one. And now what people overwhelmingly want is podcasts and stuff that you can consume casually or passively. So that's definitely a big change. But I mean, the podcast thing is absolutely something I wouldn't pass up for an article space on the website now.
Well, this is the thing, and obviously we're a bit inspired by what's happening at the moment too. So we must have like about 3 or 4 or 5 episodes talking about what the decade of centenaries would be like.
Yeah.
How the decade of centenaries is going, after the decade of centenaries, our impressions of it, because that was such a big event, a big decade. Yeah.
You know what's funny? I mean, the funny thing about it is because the decade of commemorations, centenaries, is such a really formative part of Irish history. Like it's almost like I can't imagine what Ireland would be like had that decade not happened.
Yeah.
I mean, there would be an Ireland, but it would be entirely different. And so it's a central part of Irish identity, So we were almost like reliving it, the rising. Like, I mean, the country kind of stopped for a week, in the Easter night, 2016. And it's a massive time of national self-reflection, which I thought went okay, Or the famous row we had about the black and tans and the RIC
yes.
in 2020, just before the pandemic. So these were real moments of national reflection. But the weird thing, I think, about it was we were almost supposed to be reliving it. Like, we were almost supposed to be saying, let's feel the pain of the people of Balbriggan burned out by the black and tans, or, let's feel the euphoria of the people who declared the Republic in 1916, or, or further back, like the start of the decade, like let's understand the Covenant and the Ulster Unionist perspective and so on. It's almost like we're reliving it, we're playing it again. I got that feeling anyway, did you?
Yes, and it was funny the way some things really connected with the public. Like, as you say, they were reliving things, particularly with regards to 1916.
Yeah, that was the big one, yeah.
We seem to be reliving the arguments from the Troubles.
Yeah, and it's almost, but not only from the Troubles, but from the time, I mean, you have people saying, like John Bruton famously saying,
yes.
I'm a Redmondite, as if it matters, like,
Yeah,
as if John Redmond and his party is alive and kicking and wasn't buried in 1918.
Yeah.
Or the remnants of it merged with Fine Gael in 1932 or whatever it was, yeah. So like, I mean, but John Redmond said, I'm a Redmondite and I'm going to have this argument. Like, it's a current argument. Like, if I argue the rising shouldn't have happened, it might somehow stop it.
Yeah.
I'm sure there's parallels on the other side of that argument and so on. But like, I got this weird feeling that people felt a great intensity, like they must defend their point of view about that time, as if it would make a difference, like, as if it wasn't over,
And that's what I found was funny as well, is that you would see people having these arguments and debates, and when very good points have been made on the other side. Like some of these arguments have been demolished. It was as if it didn't happen.
No, it didn't
that
make any
person
difference.
would go on and make the exact same points again.
But that's because the argument is just a part of their identity. It's not
Yes.
it's not a reasoned point of view, you know.
Yeah.
And lest people think that we're being biased in any way, or this applies across the board, you know. So, for example, you know, purist Irish Republicans will argue about the Second Dáil and how they draw their legitimacy from the government of the Irish Republic that was never abolished in 1922. But simple fact, for example, that the Second Dáil voted for the Anglo-Irish Treaty, you know, it gets people really hot under the collar, and they deny that it happened and all, but it did, for example. So that's just a counterexample to...
Well, that leads on to another point, and that leads on to the role of social media. Now, that was one of the first things that we did, was set up, like, you know, Twitter and Facebook, and that's the main way that people
But I was on
contact
Twitter
us.
till quite late in the day, actually. I mean, I got on Twitter probably around 2015, 16.
Mm.
You know, Facebook was much more important for a long time. And later, you know, this is another change. The algorithms have changed. So it used to be like, basically, you posted something on Facebook, anyone who's interested would see it, and you get massive response. And that's changed because they hide it now. They want you to pay. And the same thing happened. And then Twitter was better, but then that same thing happened with Twitter. And now that Twitter is X, it's more again. So, yeah, I mean, social media has been an evolving thing. I mean, from our point of view, it's been evolving in the wrong direction. But I suppose it was inevitable because, like, when we were starting off, or we were in our midway in the show on the Irish Story, social media was losing money, you know, Facebook and stuff.
Yeah.
Like, it was much better. They were much better for us, and I think most people had better experience on them, and they were far less toxic. But they were losing money, you know, and they found a way to monetize it, which is very bad for society, but good for them, I would suggest.
Well, that's the thing. Facebook nowadays is very, very dull. It's just 90% of it is ads rather than people you actually know posting stuff.
So people don't see the things that you post.
People don't see the stuff.
And Twitter is similar, unless you can get a kind of row, to be honest, unfortunately. But that's what it's designed for now, for people to argue and to fight, you know.
Yeah, like we would...
Now, there was always, sorry to call it, but there was always an element of that, of course, in social media. So we used to use discussion forums and so on as well. And you would often have very heated arguments and so on. But it was possible to use reason, I feel. I mean, in the era of the Twitter and to a lesser extent Facebook, you have the phenomenon of the pylon, where it's not really possible to reason with people, you know. They're more like broadcasting their side, really, rather than arguing, you know.
Well, this was part of the problem. You'd notice with a podcast or an article that if you put it up and purely based on the title alone, some people would just tear into it. Mm-hmm. And you knew that they hadn't read it or listened to it if it was a podcast.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So that's very difficult to argue with, based on the fact that somebody is tearing strips off you who hasn't listened to the podcast in the first place.
Yeah, and that was, or an article, and that was 90% of the problem. I mean, you had some people, of course, argued did read the article or did listen to the thing and would still hate what you did.
Yeah.
But that's, you know, because they were not going to change their mind, whatever it was. But 90% of the time, it was like your concerns are all addressed in the show if you actually listen to it, or if it's an article, if you read the article. But yeah, I mean, internet debate was never really that civil. Like, it was always very heated and people were always very confrontational, but it has got worse. Problem is, people are rewarded now for confrontational behaviour, and they're not rewarded for like civil discussion. It's still possible to have, but much more and more rarely, I would say.
Well, that was the thing with the podcast. Like, we never intended it to be, you know, gotcha, that we'd bring on somebody who we disagreed with to ambush them with questions.
We would never do that. I mean, I think if anything, we went the other way. We got on people we kind of agreed with or sympathised with, and we would choose out what they had to say. Yeah,
because that was the idea. It was a great privilege to bring on people who were very, very interesting, or had written something that we were really interested in, and that we wanted to find out more, or maybe find out more about what they'd written about and discuss it with them. Mm-hmm. And it was a great opportunity because there was people that...
And that's what we do, yeah.
Yeah, as a student or as a writer or whatever, that this was great. You could bring on a really interesting historian. And one of the things that I think had a big effect on the show as well was, bizarrely, COVID.
Yeah, I was going to say that. Yeah, COVID had a massive effect. I mean, we were... Bizarrely, certainly in the first year of COVID, we're very productive, much more productive.
Very productive.
I mean, part of this is also family life, like people having kids and buying houses and stuff, which gets in the way. But COVID certainly was the one time where we were cranking out a show every week.
Absolutely. And that's the thing, because everybody was at home. Well, most people were at home. Mm-hmm. And we really discovered Zoom during COVID.
Yeah.
That anybody anywhere around the world,
I mean,
if you ask them.
We did remote interviews before Zoom, but I can't remember how we did them. We did them by phone in Near
Yeah,
FM.
Near FM in studio.
But that was it, I think.
That was it. We interviewed people in other countries.
Do you know what the fascinating one actually was about? The one with the American author about the civil rights activist?
Yes, that's right.
What was the name of those guys again?
Mike Chenoy. That's was one, with a book he wrote about Kevin Boyle.
Yeah, exactly. And he was in Hong Kong, I think.
That's right.
Yeah,
that's right.
That was again a COVID era.
Yeah. And people had more time as well for making podcasts. So when COVID started, I thought, this is brilliant for us. We're going to, everyone's going to be at home listening to podcasts or walking around the thing. But there was an explosion.
Yes, to a degree, actually. That did work for us. But but everybody was doing a podcast at the time.
Everyone was doing a podcast.
Some of them, and I will name no names, by the way, but some of whom were just reading out articles which one may have written, by the way, and they were reading them out word for word. Now, those people have mostly not lasted, so I shall name no names. But that did happen at that era.
That did happen.
Yeah.
And you're rightly still quite upset about it. But
irked, I would say.
Irked.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, anybody who, a lot of people who had been working in museums, history teachers, tour guides, all these different writers, all these different type of people had all this time on their hands. So they started doing history podcasts as well. And some of them were excellent, which really crowded the field for us. But it was great for consumers of history podcasts because there was so much choice there.
I want to talk a bit more about COVID in a second, actually, because I have some theories, not about COVID virus or anything people will be pleased to know, but about the effect on society. But I just want to talk a bit about the evolution of the Irish history podcast scene. So when we started, it was pretty much ourselves, Finn Dwyer, Irish history podcast, who's still going. Shout out to Finn there, if he's listening. I can't think of another one from back then. Maybe there was another one, but I can't think.
There's a couple, like the History of Ireland obviously had their podcast going for a while.
Hedge School.
The Hedge School.
Yeah. The Hedge School is more, though, if people are not familiar, that Tommy Graham of History of Ireland records live. So they're mainly live events. And they've become more a digital thing as time's gone by.
But then as well, the like the actual big radio station podcast. So like News Talks, Talking History.
With Patrick Gagan.
Gagan.
Which I was on. Patrick Gagan, actually a very nice guy and a good interviewer.
Yeah, I was on the two myself.
Yeah, a good man. And Miles Dungan, which I've been on. I've been on a few times since then as well. And he's still going strong on RT as well.
He's still going strong.
Fair play. But recently Donald Fallon, of course, has been a sensation.
Yeah.
I mean, Donald
very,
Fallon,
very popular.
Donald Fallon and his friends did, of course, the Come Here To Me blog, which I don't think had an audio aspect. Or if it did, it was very limited. Yeah. But Donald forged out by himself and made the Three Castles Burning podcast, which is done in history only, but it's a sensation.
Yeah, it's very, very popular.
There's been an Irish medieval podcast, which again covers stuff that we don't cover, but so fair play to them. I haven't listened to it extensively. I've listened to bits and pieces, but it's good to see it out there.
Yes, there's so much stuff, and there's a lot of different Troubles podcasts.
That's true. I haven't delved in deep, but there's a lot of them I've noticed,
Yeah.
And that again, I think, comes around to you have a certain distance and people start examining what went on. And I think they mostly look at the 70s, which again would conform to my theory, that you need a certain distance.
Well, that's the thing. We were very lucky to have Ed Maloney on, who had written a biography of Ian Paisley.
Yeah, also was written on the Provisional IRA, but we had him on about Ian Paisley.
Yeah, and that was a very popular podcast. Yeah. And also...
we got a certain amount of stick in some quarters, but it's a very controversial topic, of course, so that's to be expected.
Yeah, and again, if you're doing controversial, and there's nothing really gets more controversial in an Irish context than doing anything to do with the Troubles. People are almost sitting there waiting for you to say something that they could even interpret as being biased against their views. And most of the time when you read back the comments, you're like, I don't even know what you're objecting to.
Yeah, or you haven't listened to the show.
You obviously haven't listened to it.
But you know what, though? I mean, just for fairness, something that crossed my mind was one feedback I got. I don't know if it was an article or a podcast, but someone wrote, I'm still waiting for the podcast which celebrates people who served the Union and supported the connection with Britain. And I was thinking, you may be waiting a long time for that. So we do have our own biases. We can't deny that. I mean, we try not to be biased, but it's not like we have no opinions about Irish history.
Of course, but is the role of a history podcast to be celebrating anybody?
No, not
celebrating. No, we have our own views towards...
We really haven't, we have had shows about unionism, but not that many,
No, we've been... We've had some great guests like Garrett Mulveno's talking about the Starting Gangs.
For sure, yeah.
And then we've covered Southern Unionism and...
The Orange Order, we have a show on.
The Orange Order. and then like, you know, pre-partition unionism too.
Yeah.
But and that's all part of the
We've discussed
tapestry.
sectarianism among Irish Republicans as well, you know.
Yeah.
Including, I mean, more recent things like the murder of Billy Fox with Brian Hanley.
Yeah.
It was one we recorded up in Coolock, but in Near FM. So it's not that we haven't covered it, but we don't concentrate on it. It's true, you know. We don't concentrate on unionism.
Yes, but like somebody saying that when are we going to celebrate, or where's, as if that's a counterbalance to some of the other stuff we've been doing. We don't really feel the need to be celebrating.
No, that's a fair point. And I mean, you know, like I remember seeing one particularly witless, if I may say, comment was on, I think we have a show on the North King Street Massacre of 1916,
Yeah.
which is where the British Army broke into houses on North King Street and along near Dorset Street in Dublin, and they killed the civilian men who they found there during the Rising. They killed 15, I think. And someone said, you know, this is an outrageously biased thing to bring up. So what? We should shut up. Like, you know, this, should we not mention it? You know, so this, people do it. And again, it's like people, just by bringing it up, you know, you're doing wrong.
Yeah. But like, my God, isn't the whole idea of a history podcast, for want of a better word, to be raking up the past?
Absolutely, yeah. And I mean, including the unpleasant bits.
Yeah.
I mean, we've also tackled kind of in an oblique way, you know, some of the questions that came up. Like, during the COVID period, you had the Black Lives Matter movement and, you know, protests and so on in America and some in Ireland, you know, but it gave rise to a discourse in Ireland at the time that Ireland had to atone for its sins, the British Empire. So we addressed that in somewhat of an oblique way, but we did talk about like the British Empire in the Middle East, and we did talk about Ireland and the Zulu War in South Africa. We did address those things in a kind of oblique way. So we were also influenced by those kind of
the zeitgeist of what's going on at the moment.
Exactly. Yeah. Now, one thing I wanted to get onto. So we talked about like the context of when we started, and it was the crash era and so on. And I mean, you know, in the 2010s, the late 2010s, the country was recovering, but it was very much based on multinationals, really. And I mean, you can see the change in Ireland and the housing crisis that results from a lot more people living in the country, but also, you know, speculation on property, which is part of how the strategy of the Irish government of how they would recover from the crash was explicitly bringing in foreign companies and foreign investors, developers, and so on. Now, this is just my theory, so I'm interested to hear your thoughts on this. But like at the start of the COVID period, we were very productive, and it was kind of like a lot of people wanted to hear what we had to say and historians had to say. As the COVID era went on, people started to feel very disaffected with the length of the lockdown and so on, but it did lead, I feel, to people saying, okay, well, I'm not interested in, you know, the experts, I'm not interested in other people's truths, I'm going to just make it up for myself. Like, I think conspiracies and alienation from the way Ireland has developed, now, not just Ireland, but I mean, we have, this is our own particular story, it has really developed. So like now, if one says something, I do think this is true, like in the post-COVID period, if one says something that people don't agree with or don't want to hear, they'll just say, well, I'm not listening to that because I have my own truth, you know. And I do think this is a product in an indirect way of the COVID era, the lockdown era. I don't know if you agree with that.
Yes and no. There's definitely a huge amount in that. And it's true what you're saying. Some of the stuff, taken into the historical context and going back to social media, because a lot of these debates are on social media. Yeah. You'd see it with, like, you know, De Valera and Collins, and people's truth is that, like, you know, they've taken sides on that. Now, that did exist before COVID, but really exacerbated by COVID, I think. Yeah. And it's only, I think, maybe 10 years from now or 20 years from now, when we look back at the COVID period, just how bizarre it was, but like the level of lockdowns and
with 2 years really being,
it was very authoritarian.
Yeah, and I mean, we don't want to go down this road of discussing that, and certainly I don't subscribe to any of the conspiracy theories, but I will say that the effect of locking down society and doing things like, you know, having a 5 kilometre limit on how you can travel are very quite extreme measures, and it has, I think it should be appreciated in hindsight about how much of an effect this did have on society. You know, I think that there's no doubt, and I think that people need to reflect on this. Not saying that, you know, the virus wasn't real, the virus was real, nothing like that, but just the people have to reflect that it did have an effect on society. It wasn't something that can be forgotten just like that.
Yeah, and everybody's experience was different in some ways, because, like, you know, I'm married with small kids, so I'm not going out much anyway. So it didn't affect me that much. But at a later stage, I was working with people who had spent their entire college career, if they're doing 2-year courses or 3-year courses, at home in their bedroom. They'd missed out on the entire social life of college. So how this will be written about or dealt with in the future will be interesting to see. So people's experience of it depends on, your age group, all that type of stuff.
Yeah, and I mean, so again, from a historical point of view, what I'm trying to say here is that whether the measures are were right or wrong at that time, the effect of it has definitely, I feel, been a lack of trust in authority and in experts and so on. And that's why conspiracy theories have flourished and so on. But it's also, I mean, as I'm trying to get at, Ireland is changing. It's changing very rapidly now. And especially you've seen it in the post-COVID period. So naturally, we know as history people, this affects how people look at history. So,
yeah,
you look at the various uses of the Irish flag now, the tricolour.
Yeah.
And people don't necessarily understand what the flag is supposed to mean using it for various reasons. And I don't want to get into that. But this also affects the way people look at history. So people arguing about what the founders of the Irish state died for and so on, and the people in 1916 has taken on a different meaning when it's paired with immigration and opposition to immigration and support for immigration. You have people at demonstrations on both sides of the fence waving the tricolour and
claiming the legacy.
And claiming the legacy, so there's a whole new set of meanings being applied to Irish history now. I feel like the use of, we talked about this before, we had a show about the Ulster Plantation, which was more because I'd been reading a book about it rather than the use of it. But I mean, I'm not sure how well people understand the 17th century plantations, but it's used as propaganda against modern immigration. So people are referring to Irish history. It's a whole new set of meanings being placed on the past. But this is normal. This is the standard thing. History's always like this.
It's part of course.
But Ireland is changing, is what I'm saying. And therefore, history changes.
As we discussed before, that in the 50th anniversary of the 1916 Rising, people were using it as a backdrop to look how forward thinking and look at the Ireland we have today. And then in the 100th anniversary they were doing the same thing. They were like, look at the modern Ireland now and look at all this type of stuff. And wouldn't they be proud of it?
I mean, I think in the 100th there was in the 50th there was also it was contested meanings.
Oh yeah, and there always will be.
And always will be, yeah. So it's not like a monolith. Interestingly, when we had recently met, you wrote a good article for the website on the 50th anniversary of the Rising, and opened my eyes to the fact that it wasn't such a monolith. Like the stereotype was, it was just an orgy of self-congratulation. Yeah. Actually wasn't that way, Yeah. Like John Lemass's take on it was quite revisionist.
Yes, yeah.
And you had the Republican movement at the time was mostly centred south of the border, and quite, the very strong kind of leftist but also kind of traditionalist take that the Free State government was illegitimate and so on. But those currents were quite strong at the time. So even in 1966 there was a lot of, you brought this home to me really, but in 2016 that was also the case. I mean, I think it was adopted for all sorts of causes of course, but no commemoration, certainly in a democratic society, is ever going to be monolithic.
And this brings us back to COVID as well. One of the other effects of COVID was that with the decade of centenaries there was so many interesting stuff happening, so many interesting commemorations, but during COVID that was all suspended, all the public stuff. So for example, the anniversary of the Bloody Sunday in Croke Park, that was done with to an empty Croke Park. I was broadcast on television. They did do something or other, didn't they? Oh, they did. They had Brendan Gleeson, a lot of things in Croke Park, but no public there. It was just broadcast on television.
Yeah. And the burning of Cork, which was December 1920, and the city council in Cork lit up buildings electronically to represent the burning of Cork. And stuff like that, the sack of Balbriggan and so on, basically the whole War of Independence era commemorations were missed.
And that sort of took the steam out of it a lot.
Well, except online where you still had ferocious polemics.
Oh yeah, but I think in terms of the whole decade itself, it sort of took the momentum out of it, of people, the general public being involved in things.
Yeah, I suppose it did. I mean, the thing is, of course, just before COVID arrived and the lockdowns and everything, you had a massive controversy about the RIC, commemorating the RIC, which I'm on record, we had a show about this, as saying I thought was a very bad idea, for the very simple reason that the Irish state cannot celebrate the people who fought against its foundation, and I think this is a fairly obvious point and I won't labour it. But I mean, that really did mobilise the public, and it was one of those occasions where I thought that not all, but I mean the majority of academia perhaps and the commentary got it wrong, they were trying to make out that people who were opposed to the commemoration didn't know what they were on about, and they foolishly thought that the Black and Tans and the RIC were the same thing. Well, they were. A scholar of the RIC, the man who knows more than anyone about the RIC, and who was very sympathetic to them, actually, much more than I would be, Sean Gannon, explicitly writes, and he wrote a very good article, more than one, for the Irish Story. The Black and Tans were recruits into the RIC, so it was one of those debates where actually some of the people who were taking what they termed a mature stance actually had got the facts wrong.
Yes, and there was a long period where no matter how many times it was pointed out to them,
I wouldn't go
that they were wrong.
So it just goes to show this goes both ways, that people don't want to take in stuff that they don't like. And it's not just the plebs, it's also...
Because it didn't suit the narrative that the people in Ireland are all backwards and they're lacking in generosity because they won't commemorate the RIC, and aren't because they're associating it with the Black and Tans and they were a completely different body. And it's like, that's not the case.
That's not true,
Yeah.
And I mean, Leo Varadkar at the time said, well, we commemorated the Irish soldiers who died in the First World War in the British Army, and so therefore I think we'll get around to commemorating the Black and Tans. But this was, to my ears anyway, a very historically illiterate position.
Absolutely.
Those are two absolutely different things. The soldiers died in France and Flanders and Gallipoli and so on weren't fighting against the foundation of an independent Ireland.
Yes.
So that was that was my take now. But that might seem like unreconstructed nationalism to some, but there you go. And I mean, as it does show, like as you said, that people not wanting to hear facts that they don't like is not confined to the hoi polloi, to the plebs.
I always remember that around time of the 100th anniversary of the 1916 Rising, being around Coolock and seeing how many houses had tricolours.
Absolutely.
And, the 1916 Republic of Ireland flag and things like that. But it was completely organic.
Yeah, I was at a library in Cabra. I think I was invited there by Brian Hanley, and it was an exhibition, but they had like an exhibition of pictures that primary school children had done, and they'd written, I think there was a drawing of the GPO, with of course the great symbol of the Easter Rising, and the children had written over it, our heroes,
Yeah.
And I'm enough of a revisionist to have been a little bit uncomfortable with that. But on the other hand, I mean, I would far rather that than a thing of the Irish government like repudiating the Rising.
Yeah.
So, but in hindsight, it does still look like the end of an era to me, like an understanding and a series of arguments about Irish history that look backwards to the past. Because as I said, Ireland is changing very rapidly now, and there will be all new arguments, I think, in the future.
Yes, but that's the thing with when you get to 2024, which we're in now, you have the Irish Army Mutiny, and that is very definite endpoint for the decade of centenaries. And decade is viewed very loosely because you're going back to 1911, 1912, start the Home Rule crisis.
It's really 12 years.
Yeah, it's 12 years. And, the centenaries or the dates you can look at in the 1920s, later in the 1920s. They're part of wider things, like whether it is, the assassination of Kevin O'Higgins or the 1927 election or Fianna Fáil taking their seats.
Or the formation of Fianna Fáil.
The formation of Fianna Fáil. All these types of things. It's more of a...
The Boundary Commission as well.
The Boundary Commission. It's more of looking at like a wider 1920s or a wider coming and ale in government 22 to 32. You can't really... There's no real big events that tie everything on the way there would have been from 1912 to 1924.
It was a revolutionary era, like people will argue. Like John Regan, for example, the historian, would say that there wasn't a revolution. He likes the revolutionary period. Okay, I'm good with that. But that's what it was. Like, it was a dramatic series of events, where everything was changed. Changed utterly in Yeats' phrase. Now, if not everything was changed in Ireland, it was changed enough. It really was turned upside down. It just getting onto that though, I mean, the final phase of it actually was post-COVID, so the Civil War.
Yeah.
And I thought that went off again quite well. There wasn't animosity, which I don't think there should be at this remove. And there wasn't that much, I mean, there wasn't very strong debates either, which you can view as a good or a bad thing, but I was happy that there wasn't animosity anyway about the Civil War centenary. Yeah,
there was the one area that there seemed to be the most concentration on was the Civil War in Kerry. Yeah. And there was a lot of...
well, of course, most of the horrible...
Of course.
Or so many of the horrible things that happened in the Civil War happened in Kerry.
Yeah, and you were speaking at that conference down in Kerry.
Yeah, in Tralee. I mean, so Tralee, just outside, is this huge monument to the Ballyseedy massacre, 1923. But there was very little animosity. Even though in Kerry, lots of people have relatives who were involved and who were killed and imprisoned and mistreated and killed on the Free State side too. Kerry men died on that side too. But I cannot say there was animosity. People took their heritage, if you like, with them to the conference, and in private especially they would speak about that, and in some cases, like, of the pain that the families suffered, of people who were executed, the families left destitute. Like, people came up to me and talked about that. But animosity, no. I mean, there was, and don't get me wrong, it was out there even in the 2020s. Like, the monument at Knocknagoshel to the Free State or National Army soldiers was smashed, I think, several times during the decade commemoration. So that's not that there is no animosity, but I mean, it wasn't used by anyone for party political reasons, which was good to see. I mean, funny enough, Sinn Féin, the modern Sinn Féin party, did use the black and tan issue a certain amount, and it did help them in the 2020 election, I feel. But they didn't want to jump on the Civil War, which is probably a good thing, I would say.
Well, the Civil War seems to be more muted among the public than the 2016 was, and probably for obvious reasons.
Yeah.
It's more contested, it's more of a grey area.
I thought it was interesting in showing that some of the historical understanding, if that's the right word, of the political people now, not historians, in Sinn Féin. So they didn't really want to associate themselves with that. Now, they could have. They could say, like, these people betrayed the Republic in 1922, and they're still betraying the people today because of housing or so on. Like, I'm not saying that's right, but that they could have used that, and they didn't. Whereas they were quite happy to use the black and tan controversy, I think, to their advantage. And I thought that was interesting because, I mean, to a degree, I don't know, you don't seem to agree with that.
No. I was just remembering something that you said about the speaking at some of the Civil War conferences, that people from a Fianna Fáil background seem to be far more animated and far more bitter about the events of the Civil War than people from a Sinn Féin background, funnily enough.
That's correct. Now, the people I met, you see, in Sinn Féin were generally people who joined the Republican movement, or the Provisional Republican movement, if you prefer, due to the Northern Troubles. Some of them had a Republican background going further, but a lot of them didn't. Like, I'm thinking of various people joined around the time of the hunger strikes in 1981.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, they would have associated the Civil War in their time with, the special branch would harass them, so the Free State were still traitors and so on. But the real enemy was the British. And that seems to be the attitude in Sinn Féin, or, the modern political party Sinn Féin is a very different beast. Not only to what it was 100 years ago, but to what it was 20 years ago. And I would suggest that the historical knowledge and understanding may have dimmed a little bit, as the party has gone into mainstream politics. So they prefer things that are quite easy to understand, like the struggle against the British, rather than the Civil War, which is very rooted in Republican tradition. Like, Republicans were obsessed with it, for many decades afterwards. But it's not so easy to explain to the general public.
Now,
Fianna Fáil and also Fine Gael people would have family directly involved. A lot of them would be older people, so you'd be only removed by one generation. And some of them would get very upset discussing various incidents in the Civil War where their relatives had been involved, which was interesting. And I did speak at an event that was kind of independent Republican. I didn't get that at all. Like, people just wanted to talk about the ins and outs, but weren't that exercised about it. Whereas, things with relatives, people whose families had been very strongly Fianna Fáil or Fine Gael, it was different. That was where you would find it more emotion, I would say.
Yeah. Some of the things that we do have to sit down and me and you have a chat about is areas that we would like to cover, maybe in the next 100 episodes. We'll probably get the pension by the time the 200th one is done. Yeah. But, like, you mentioned it there before, I'd love to do some more stuff about medieval Ireland and Viking Dublin, things like that. But Irish history is so vast, and not just Irish history, but how Irish history interacts with the histories of other countries. And
we have done some of that. We have
absolutely
ranged further afield. We've talked about the First World War. We've talked about the Middle East. We've talked about South Africa, Ukraine, Russia. We've had various discussions, but we certainly would be open to doing more. We'll have to probably get more guests in, like, because we're out of our comfort zone talking about the ancient world or talking about medieval time and all. But I mean, it reminds me of something like History Ireland, the magazine, Tommy Graham's magazine, used to do in-depth interviews with kind of history professors. They don't really do that anymore, but I remember one, and mea culpa, I forget the name of the gentleman involved, but he said medieval Irish history, early medieval Irish history, is much more important than modern Irish history, even though it doesn't get much attention. And he said, why? Because from an intellectual point of view, medieval Ireland, early medieval Ireland, was really important. You know, it brought Christianity back to much of Europe and so on, preserved, you know, learning and so on. And he said, modern Ireland is something that nobody in the rest of the world cares about. Whereas, you know, medieval Ireland was something really important. Now that struck me because I know virtually nothing about early medieval Ireland.
Yes.
So, I would naturally have a bias towards the modern period, or the early modern period, even to an extent, which I studied myself. But that's something that really stayed with me over the years, though.
Well, I think that's something that I've always found, is that I've looked at Irish history backwards. Mm-hmm. Like, my first interest in Irish history, like as young teen or whatever, was like the Troubles or like Irish history in the 80s, because my dad would have had the house filled with books about like recent history, or
Garrett and Charlie and stuff.
Garrett and Charlie, or, you know, Trouble stuff.
The Orange Trial, which, by the way, listeners, Cahill is an encyclopedia on the which we did have an episode on.
We did, with Brian Hanley.
Yeah.
Again. But when you start studying it at college level, and obviously all the other 20th century stuff to do with 1916 and War of Independence, Civil War, etc. But when you start studying at college level, you'd say, well, you can't really understand the early 20th century unless you look at the 19th century. And then obviously you can't understand the 19th century unless you understand the 18th century. And you keep going back and back and back. And it gives you a much deeper understanding into Irish history. And then even further back, it takes into account all the mythology and the, you know, things to do with the Irish language, all this type of stuff, the cultural aspect of Irish history too.
Yeah, like, actually it would be useful if listeners could give us feedback on what they'd like to hear, but things I would like to do, like things that we've had ideas on and we just haven't got around to yet. Like, I know a person who's studying the Fianna and the legends of the Fianna, like Fionn McCool and the ancient Fianna now, and if we could get someone to talk about that, or maybe the Ulster cycle, the Cuchulainn myths, that'd be fascinating. Viking Dublin you mentioned, I mean, we're both Dubliners, and it'd be fascinating to listen to the history of Dublin. We've both also done walking tours around the city of Dublin, which also increases one's curiosity, I think.
Absolutely.
About the city.
And you know, you have to do a major amount of research and reading back, but I was thinking of stuff that I haven't done since, you know, you're initially studying medieval Irish history, and it's sort of a thing that you pass through on your way to what you really want to.
And do you have any ideas like that you'd like to do going forward?
Oh God, loads of stuff. And it's mainly around things that we haven't covered already. Now, there's still areas.
We've been very decade focused, but I think that's understandable. Decade focused.
It would be hard to ignore it.
Yeah.
Now, as you said there with, like, you know, the listeners, there's nothing we enjoy more in terms of making the podcast than getting feedback from the listeners. And we've been so lucky that we've gotten feedback from, God, all over the world, like.
Yeah.
Or bumped into people, bizarrely, who've actually listened to the show. Because when you do a show like that, obviously you can see the views and everything and how many people are listening. But when you encounter people in real life, you go, oh, I've heard your podcast. It's fantastic. It's the best feeling in the world.
Yeah, it's very good.
Yeah.
I mean, if I could just plug a couple of ideas I have also for articles on the Irish story. So I know I haven't been terribly productive of late, but I've been busy with the UCC Fatalities Project. I'm also recently travelling around the country talking about it, promoting it. But I did an article, for example, about how the Belfast newsletter, the Unionist newspaper, covered the Irish Civil War. But I want to do one as well on how the United Irishmen understood Cromwell and his regime in Ireland. Which, you know, this kind of stuff. I also want to do one on the Protestant roots of Irish republicanism, which is connected with that topic as well. Yeah. So I hope, I've been assembling notes and I've been reading a book which I admired since my undergraduate days, Jim Smith's The Men of No Property, which I want to go back for. But I'm hopefully going to have articles on that, and maybe we can do a podcast on that stuff as well.
Well, that's a fantastic thing about having the show, is that you can have an idea, there's something you're curious about. We can either do it ourselves or get in a guest, and then hopefully the people who listen to the show would find it interesting too.
Yeah, now I have reams of material still about the Irish Civil War, because that's what I've been working on for the last, 10 years. But I'm going to do some more about that, but really need to branch out a little bit.
Yeah, I think we might be at Civil War overload at this stage.
Yeah, but just, things that I do have in note form, which I will make into articles. So I do have a lot of notes on coming a man in the Civil War through the eyes of the Free State authorities and the National Army in particular, which I think would be an interesting article. Also, I have a lot of notes on Tom Barry in the Civil War. So those are two anyway. I've at least two more Civil War articles left in me.
Yeah.
And maybe we can do a show about them. I don't know.
Yeah, that sounds good.
But it's always interesting to, come at something from a slightly different perspective, Like one article that I did, we didn't make a show about it, not yet anyway, but it was about the William of Orange statue in Dublin, which has a fascinating history.
That's right. Yes, particularly when something like, as you say, Dublin loyalism, it doesn't really exist. Now there's a tiny...
I mean, there are pockets of it. I have met people of that persuasion, actually,
but it's not a force in the way it would have been.
No. It hasn't been a force for 100 years. Really.
Yeah, a century ago. So, history that's sort of gone by the wayside, that is very, very interesting. And talking about it. And there might be a lot of people who have no idea that there was Orange Lodges all over Dublin.
Oh, yeah.
And Conservative clubs all over Dublin.
Yeah, and it is actually, there still is a Conservative
there is still
club.
one.
And it still does have that character. I know one or two people who are members of such a club. But
pictures of the Queen up inside it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, person in question called his daughter Victoria. I'm not giving away any confidences there. But, I wouldn't be a terribly huge admirer of Neil Ferguson, the celebrity historian. But he did say one thing which I agree with, and he said you do have to consider the counterfactuals, the things that didn't happen, because they help you understand the thing that did happen. It helps you look into the possibilities. So I think when you get to something like that is unusual or didn't quite happen, or that's when it really sharpens your understanding. So hopefully we can do that kind of thing, in the future.
Yes, and as I said, the only request I'd have is from you, the listeners, if you had a favourite episode over the past 100 episodes, maybe contact us. The best way to contact us is over Twitter, and that's at Irish History Pod. And just say, when we put the episode up, just say, well, I like this one, I like that one.
Or you can also leave comments on both the website of the Irish History Show or the Irish Story, because they'll be posted on both.
Yep. And hopefully we'll cover a lot more episodes in the future, hopefully a bit more regularly. But just again to say thank you very, very much. Thank you to all the guests who've come on, who've given so generously of their time. Everyone who sent us books to review, and then we've had the authors on at a later stage. And obviously as well, Mr. Dorney, thank you very much.
And Mr. Brennan.
Yes.
Back at you.
It's been, because that's how we got to know each other, through the podcast.
It's been emotional.
It's been a history marriage over the ages.
And on that note. So if you want to follow us, we're on Twitter at Irish History Pod, on Facebook, facebook.com/The Irish History Show. We have our website, irishhistoryshow.ie, and also John's website, theirishstory.com. And if you're that way inclined after 100 episodes that you'd like to donate, there is a Patreon for the show, that the link is in the show notes. So until next time, thank you very much for 100 episodes. Thank you very, very much for listening.
Radio.ie hosts the Irish History Show podcast because history matters. Radio turns 100 years young this year. Radio's history is powered by Radio Archives. For radio archiving solutions from people passionate about radio, visit radio.ie.